Good evening, and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Tonight we travel back more than 5 centuries to the hills of Renaissance Italy, where the life of one of history's most extraordinary minds began. Imagine a boy born with no legal right to his father's name, who never attended a university, never mastered Latin as a child, and was considered, by the standards of his own time, illegitimate and unfit for polite society. Now picture that same boy growing up to paint the most famous portrait in the history of the world. Picture him sketching the mechanics of flight 400 years before the first airplane left the ground. Picture him dissecting human corpses by candlelight to understand the exact curve of a smile, and filling thousands of pages with mirror writing that only he could easily read, notes on water, on birds, on shadows, on the beating of the human heart. This is the story of Leonardo da Vinci, a man who left behind only a handful of finished paintings, and yet is remembered as perhaps the most complete human mind of the last 1,000 years. A man who worked so slowly, so obsessively, so unwilling to declare anything truly done, that kings and popes grew impatient waiting for him to finish what he had promised. A man who called himself, without shame, a disciple of experience rather than of books, at a time when books were considered the only respectable source of wisdom. How does someone with so little formal education come to understand anatomy better than the physicians of his age, engineering better than the military architects, and light and shadow better than any painter before him? That is the question this story will try to answer, slowly and without hurry, the way Leonardo himself preferred to work. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Nighttime Biographies. And if the hype button is available to you, tap it to help this story climb the leaderboard and reach more listeners. I would also love to know where in the world, and at what time, you're joining me tonight. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from, and whose life story you would like to hear next. And now, settle in. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders soften, and allow the noise of the modern world to fade away. Before we can understand the man who painted the Mona Lisa, we have to go back more than 5 centuries, to a small hill town in the Tuscan countryside, to a spring evening in the year 1452, when a child was born who was not supposed to matter very much at all. Let us return now to Tuscany, and to the world before Leonardo. In the middle of the 15th century, the land we now call Italy did not exist as a single country. It was instead a patchwork of city-states, republics, and duchies, each with its own laws, its own currency, its own loyalties, and often its own private wars. Florence was among the wealthiest and most powerful of these, a city of wool merchants and bankers, of guilds and cathedrals, ruled in practice, though not always in name, by the Medici family. Florence in this era was entering into what later centuries would call the Renaissance, a slow reawakening of interest in the art, philosophy, and science of ancient Greece and Rome, a period when artists began to be seen not merely as skilled craftsmen, but as men capable of genius. Outside the walls of Florence, connected to the city by a network of dirt roads winding through olive groves and vineyards, lay smaller towns that depended on the city for trade and protection, while keeping their own quieter rhythms of life. One of these was Vinci, a modest hill town about 17 miles west of Florence, perched above the Arno Valley, surrounded by fields, cypress trees, and the low stone walls that still mark that landscape today. It was a place of farmers and small landholders, of church bells marking the hours, of slow seasons following one after another with the reliability of the sun itself. It was here, in this quiet corner of Tuscany, that the story of Leonardo begins, not with him, but with his father. Ser Piero da Vinci came from a respectable family of notaries, men whose profession was to draft legal documents, record property transactions and witness contracts, a position of modest but genuine standing in Florentine society. The da Vinci family had held this role for at least 4 generations, and young Piero, ambitious and capable, seemed destined to continue the tradition and perhaps improve upon it. He was 25 years old in the spring of 1452, already building a career that would eventually take him into the service of the most powerful institutions in Florence, including, later in his life, the government of the Republic itself. The woman who would become Leonardo's mother is a far more elusive figure in the historical record. Her name was Caterina, and for centuries her exact identity remained a matter of scholarly guesswork. She was almost certainly a young peasant woman of humble origins, possibly the daughter of a local farming family, possibly according to research published in recent decades by historians examining tax and land records of the period. A woman with a name that appears in a nearby document as Caterina di Meolipi. What is clear from the surviving evidence is that she and Ser Piero were not married, and that their social stations were far enough apart that marriage between them was never seriously considered. Ser Piero would go on within the same year to marry a woman of appropriate status named Albiera di Giovanni Amadori, beginning the first of what would eventually be 4 marriages over the course of his life. Caterina, not long after, would marry a local man known by the nickname Acatabriga, a labourer who worked in the lime kilns of the region. This was not, in itself, considered a scandal of the sort we might imagine today. Illegitimacy in 15th century Tuscany was common enough among all classes of society, and children born outside of marriage were frequently absorbed into their father's household, especially when the father, like Ser Piero, held a stable position and no legitimate heir yet existed. The stigma was real, but it was a manageable one, a fact of birth rather than a permanent sentence. The evening was the 15th of April in the year 1452, a Saturday, according to the notation later made by Leonardo's grandfather, Ser Antonio, a careful and literate man who kept his own family records with the precision of his profession. Antonio wrote in his notebook that a grandson had been born to him, and gave the hour with unusual exactness, a detail historians have used since to attempt astrological reconstructions of the birth, though nothing definitive survives regarding what significance, if any, the family placed on the timing beyond simple pride. The child was baptized the following day in the small church of Santa Croce in Vinci and given the name Leonardo. In the tradition of the time, names were often chosen for their meaning or their association with a saint, and Leonardo carried the sense of lion-hearted, brave as a lion, though there is no record that this meaning was consciously intended by his family. 10 godparents stood as witnesses at the baptism, an unusually large number that suggests, whatever her modest station, Caterina and her family were reasonably well regarded within the small community of Vinci, and that the da Vinci family did not seek to hide the child away, or treat the event as shameful. For the first years of his life it appears Leonardo lived primarily with his mother, in or near Vinci, though the precise arrangement remains debated among historians. Some evidence suggests he may have spent time in both households, moving between his mother's home and his father's family, in the flexible manner common to illegitimate children of the era who were nonetheless acknowledged by their fathers. By around the age of 5, most historians agree, Leonardo had come to live primarily in the household of his grandfather Antonio, alongside his father, his father's new wife, and eventually his uncle Francesco, Ser Piero's younger brother, who by many accounts became something of a companion and mentor to the young boy during these formative years. The house itself sat on a small piece of land the family owned near Vinci, a farmhouse of stone with outbuildings for animals and storage, surrounded by the fields and hills that would later appear, transformed by memory and imagination, in the misty blue mountains that recur again and again in Leonardo's later paintings. It was not a house of luxury, it was a house of practical Tuscan life, olive oil pressed each autumn, grain harvested in summer, animals tended through the winter, the seasons marking time far more reliably than any calendar. What did the young Leonardo see in these early years? We can only imagine, but we can imagine with some confidence, given what we know of the landscape and what we know of the man he became. He would have seen the terraced hillsides, silver green with olive trees. He would have seen the Arno River's tributaries cutting through limestone. He would have watched birds, kestrels and swallows wheeling above the valley, an early fascination that would occupy him for the rest of his life. He would have seen his uncle Francesco, who by most accounts lived a quiet agricultural life on the family land, and who seems to have shared with young Leonardo a love of the natural world, the movement of water, the behaviour of animals, the practical mechanics of farm tools and mills. This would mark him forever. Long before Leonardo ever picked up a brush in a formal workshop, before he ever studied under a master, he had already begun the habit that would define his entire life, watching closely and asking why. Consider for a moment what the physical landscape of Vinci itself may have taught him. The town sits on the lower slopes of Monte Albano, a modest mountain whose streams, in wet seasons, cut small ravines through soft limestone, carrying sediment down toward the Arno Valley below. A curious child wandering those slopes would have encountered, without ever using the word geology, direct physical evidence of how water shapes stone over time, how sediment layers itself in bands, how fossils of ancient sea creatures sometimes appear embedded in rock, lifted high above any modern shoreline. Decades later, in his notebooks, Leonardo would write with startling clarity about the presence of fossilized shells found in the mountains of Tuscany, correctly reasoning, against the prevailing wisdom of his era, that these were the true remains of ancient sea creatures rather than curiosities produced by some mysterious force within the rock itself, and that the land itself must once have lain beneath the sea, only rising to its present height over an immense span of time far longer than the biblical timeline most educated Europeans of his century assumed. It is not difficult to imagine the seeds of this later insight being planted in a boy who spent his early childhood walking those same hillsides, turning over stones, noticing what others walked past without a second glance. The town of Vinci itself, though small, was not entirely isolated from the wider currents of Tuscan life. Merchants passed along the roads connecting Florence to Pisa and Lucca. News, however delayed by the standards we know today, still travelled along those same roads, carrying word of the political manoeuvring of the Medici family, of new building projects rising in Florence, of the general sense, felt even in small towns, that something remarkable was stirring in the cultural life of the region. Leonardo's grandfather Antonio, and later his uncle Francesco, would have had at least some awareness of this wider world, and it is likely that young Leonardo grew up hearing, even if only in fragments, stories of the great cathedral dome recently completed in Florence, of the wealth and ambition of the city that lay less than a day's journey from his own front door. At the same time, his early years were shaped just as powerfully by the ordinary rhythms of rural life that had changed little in generations. He would have known the specific labour of the olive harvest each autumn, the pressing of oil in stone mills, the slaughter and preservation of meat before winter, the careful rationing of stored grain through the leaner months of the year. These were not abstractions for a child growing up in Vinci. They were the visible, tangible mechanics of survival, and it is perhaps no accident that the adult Leonardo, across his engineering notebooks, showed such a persistent fascination with mills, presses, gears, and the practical machinery of ordinary labour, sketching improved designs for devices that a less observant child might never have thought twice about. Formal education in 15th century Tuscany for a boy of Leonardo's uncertain status was a modest affair. As an illegitimate son, Leonardo was barred from the professions that required university training and formal Latin scholarship. The paths that might have led him, had circumstances been different, to follow his father into the notary trade, or into law, or into the church hierarchy. This exclusion, which might have crushed a lesser spirit, or channeled a different kind of boy into bitterness, seems instead to have freed Leonardo from a track he may never have wanted to follow in the first place. He did receive some basic instruction, almost certainly in what was called the Abaco School, a form of practical education common to merchant families in Tuscany, which taught basic reading, writing, and above all arithmetic, the kind of mathematics useful for trade and commerce, rather than the abstract philosophical education reserved for the university-bound. Leonardo would later, in his adult notebooks, express a kind of pride tinged with defensiveness about his lack of formal Latin schooling, referring to himself in one famous passage as an uomo senza lettere, a man without letters, a man unlettered in the classical tradition. He wrote this not entirely as an apology, but partly as a challenge to those who dismissed him, insisting that experience, direct observation of the world, was itself a legitimate and perhaps superior teacher to second-hand knowledge copied from ancient authorities. Consider what this meant for a curious child. Where a university-trained boy might have been taught to trust what Aristotle or Ptolemy had written centuries earlier about the natural world, Leonardo denied that path, was left instead with his own eyes, his own hands, and the physical world around him in Vinci. He would spend his boyhood, according to later biographical accounts written within decades of his death, wandering the countryside, catching lizards and insects, examining their construction, sketching what he found. He developed, even as a small child according to these early accounts, a distinct tenderness toward animals, reportedly purchasing caged birds in the market as a grown man simply for the pleasure of setting them free, a habit some biographers trace back to sensitivities formed in this rural childhood. The primary biographical source for Leonardo's early life comes from Giorgio Vasari, an artist and writer working several decades after Leonardo's death, whose book on the lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects remains an essential, if not always perfectly reliable source for Renaissance art history. Vasari, writing with the benefit of second-hand accounts and no small amount of admiring embellishment, described the young Leonardo as a boy of extraordinary physical beauty and grace, quick of mind, gifted in mathematics, and possessed of a singing voice and skill on the lyre that charmed everyone who encountered him. Vasari's account should be read with some caution, written as it was for an audience already primed to view Leonardo as a nearly mythical figure, but the consistent thread across multiple sources is one of unusual and wide-ranging talent, evident from a very young age. One story, recorded by Vasari, describes an episode involving Leonardo's father and a local peasant who had asked Ser Piero to have a wooden shield painted for him in Florence. Ser Piero, the story goes, gave the shield to young Leonardo instead, who examined it, found it warped and roughly made, and set about creating a design so startling, a monstrous creature assembled in his imagination from the parts of lizards, bats, and insects he had studied in the countryside, arranged to breathe fire and smoke through cleverly positioned devices, that when his father came to view the finished work in a darkened room, lit only to heighten the dramatic effect, he reportedly recoiled in genuine fright before realizing what he was looking at. The story, whether entirely accurate in its details or embellished in the retelling, captures something essential and consistently true about Leonardo across every reliable account. Even as a child, he combined careful observation of real, ordinary creatures with an extraordinary capacity to reimagine and recombine what he saw into something that had never existed before. This tendency to look closely at the world and then ask what else might be possible would remain the central engine of Leonardo's mind for the rest of his life. It was likely around 1464, when Leonardo was approximately 12 years old, that a significant loss touched the family. His stepmother Albiera, his father's wife who had raised him during these years, died, reportedly in childbirth, without having borne Ser Piero the legitimate heir he had hoped for. Ser Piero would remarry again the following year to a woman named Francesca, beginning a pattern that would continue throughout his life. 4 marriages in total, though it would not be until much later, after Leonardo had already grown into adulthood, that Ser Piero would finally father legitimate children, half-siblings who would eventually create considerable complications regarding inheritance after his death. By the time Leonardo was in his early teens, the family situation had shifted in a way that would prove decisive for his future. Ser Piero's notary business was thriving. He had moved his primary residence to Florence itself, the great city whose walls Leonardo would have seen many times from the countryside roads leading in from Vinci, and it seems it was around this time, in the mid-1460s, that young Leonardo came to live with his father in Florence full-time. Florence in this period was perhaps the single most extraordinary place in Europe for a talented and curious young person to find themselves. The city was in the midst of what we now recognize as the flowering of the early Renaissance. The great dome of the cathedral, engineered by Filippo Brunelleschi using techniques that had puzzled architects for generations, had been completed only decades earlier, and still dominated the skyline as a kind of daily miracle. The sculptor Donatello had, within living memory, produced bronze and marble works of a naturalism and psychological depth that had not been seen since antiquity. The Medici family, wealthy bankers who governed the city from behind a Republican facade, actively patronized artists, poets, and scholars, creating an atmosphere in which artistic ambition was not merely tolerated, but actively celebrated and rewarded. It was into this atmosphere that Ser Piero, recognizing something unusual in his son's abilities, particularly his drawing, made a decision that would shape the rest of Leonardo's life. Around 1466 or 1467, when Leonardo was approximately 14 or 15 years old, his father arranged for him to be apprenticed to one of the most respected workshops in the city, that of the sculptor, painter, and goldsmith Andrea del Verrocchio. The seeds of everything Leonardo would become were being planted in this decision. Consider what it meant in 15th century Florence to be apprenticed into a great master's workshop. It was nothing like enrolling in an art school in the modern sense. A workshop, or bottega as it was known in Italian, functioned as something between a trade guild, a family household, and a small factory. Apprentices, often boys as young as 10, lived and worked alongside the master and his assistants, learning by watching, by grinding pigments, by preparing panels and canvases, by sweeping floors, long before they were ever permitted to touch an actual commissioned work. Skills were passed down through years of physical repetition rather than lecture and theory, a training in the hands as much as in the eye. Andrea del Verrocchio ran one of the most prestigious workshops in Florence, producing not only paintings but bronze sculpture, goldsmith work, architectural ornament, and elaborate festival decorations for the city's civic celebrations. Verrocchio himself was a man of formidable and varied talent, though history has, perhaps unfairly, allowed his reputation to be somewhat overshadowed by that of his most famous pupil. His workshop received major commissions from the Medici family and from the city's most important religious institutions, and training there placed a young apprentice at the very centre of Florentine artistic life. For Leonardo, the years in Verrocchio's workshop, roughly from his mid-teens into his early 20s, provided an education far more suited to his particular mind than any university could have offered. Here, learning happened through direct physical practice, mixing pigments from raw minerals and plants, understanding how different bases affected colour and drying time, learning the mathematics of perspective through practical drawing exercises rather than abstract geometry, studying the human body through observation of live models and eventually through more direct anatomical investigation. The workshop trained him simultaneously as painter, sculptor, and engineer, since Verrocchio's commissions regularly required solving mechanical problems, how to cast a bronze statue of enormous scale, how to construct scaffolding, how to engineer the enormous copper ball that would eventually be placed atop the lantern of Florence's cathedral dome, a project on which Verrocchio's workshop was engaged during Leonardo's apprenticeship, and which Leonardo would certainly have observed and quite possibly assisted with first-hand. It was also during this period that Leonardo would have been exposed to a wider circle of Florentine intellectual life. Verrocchio's workshop was frequented by other artists, who would themselves become major figures of the Renaissance, and the broader cultural environment of Medici Florence exposed young apprentices to humanist scholars, to classical texts newly translated from Greek, to debates about mathematics, optics, and natural philosophy that were reshaping how educated Europeans understood the physical world. Leonardo denied the formal Latin education that would have opened the doors of the university directly, absorbed this intellectual ferment sideways, through conversation, through observation, through his own relentless curiosity, teaching himself Latin later in life well enough to read at least some classical texts, though he never achieved the fluency of a university-trained scholar, and seems, if anything, to have worn this as something closer to a badge of independent thought than a mark of shame. One episode from this period has become one of the most repeated stories in the history of art, recorded by Vasari and, whatever embellishments time may have added, reflecting something essential about the transition that was occurring in Leonardo's abilities. Verrocchio was completing a painting known as the Baptism of Christ, and following common workshop practice, assigned portions of the background and secondary figures to his assistants, including, the story tells us, one of the angels in the composition to young Leonardo. When the painting was finished, according to Vasari's account, Verrocchio was so struck by the superior quality of the angel his young apprentice had painted, its grace, its luminous handling of light, so far surpassing the work of his own hand in the same canvas, that he resolved never to paint again, dedicating himself from that point onward primarily to sculpture. Modern art historians view this story with some skepticism as literal fact, since Verrocchio continued to be credited with painting projects afterward, but technical analysis of the actual surviving painting, now in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, has confirmed that at least the angel on the left, along with sections of the landscape background, were indeed painted in a technique markedly different from, and, by most assessments, more advanced than the rest of the canvas, offering physical, scientific confirmation that something remarkable truly was happening in that workshop. By 1472, when Leonardo was 20 years old, he had achieved enough recognition in his craft to be formally enrolled in the Compagnia di San Luca, the Guild of Painters in Florence, a necessary step for any artist wishing to accept independent commissions. This did not mean he immediately left Verrocchio's workshop, a common practice at the time being for talented former apprentices to remain associated with their master's studio for additional years, contributing to workshop projects while gradually building an independent reputation and portfolio of their own. Records suggest Leonardo remained connected to Verrocchio's workshop in some capacity until at least the mid to late 1470s. These years were not without their difficulties. In April of 1476, an anonymous accusation was placed in one of the collection boxes Florence maintained for citizens to report moral or legal violations, alleging that Leonardo, along with 3 other young men, had engaged in sodomy with a young goldsmith's apprentice, a serious criminal charge under Florentine law at the time, carrying potentially severe penalties. The case was investigated by the city's morals court, but lacking sufficient witnesses willing to testify, the charges were dismissed after a second hearing 2 months later, in June of that year. Historians have long debated what this episode reveals about Leonardo's personal life. What can be said with confidence, based on the documented pattern of his household relationships throughout his adult life, and the near-total absence of any recorded romantic interest in women, is that Leonardo's closest personal attachments throughout his life were consistently to younger male companions and assistants, a fact acknowledged by his earliest biographers and treated by modern historians as a significant and largely undisputed element of his personal history, discussed here not to sensationalize but simply because it forms an honest part of understanding who this complex man was. Whatever anxiety this brush with the authorities may have caused the young artist, it does not appear to have derailed his growing career. By the end of the 1470s, Leonardo was beginning to receive independent commissions of his own, stepping out gradually and not without difficulty from beneath the shadow of his teacher into a career that would prove, from nearly its beginning, unlike that of any other artist of his age. If there is a single theme that runs through Leonardo's independent career as it began to take shape in the late 1470s and through the 1480s, it is this: an almost tragic gap between the scale of what he attempted and the number of things he actually completed. In 1478, Leonardo received a commission from the Florentine government itself, a chapel altarpiece for the Palazzo Vecchio, the seat of the city's government. It was never finished, and the commission was eventually transferred to another artist. Around the same period, he began work on a painting known today as St. Jerome in the Wilderness, a haunting, unfinished panel showing the aged saint kneeling in a rocky landscape, his anatomy rendered with an intensity of study that reveals Leonardo's growing fascination with the mechanics of the human body, muscle and sinew visible beneath the skin, with an accuracy that went well beyond standard artistic convention of the period. The painting survives today in the Vatican's collection, precisely as Leonardo left it, brilliant in its finished passages, ghostly and incomplete in others, a monochrome study frozen part-way toward a final vision that never realized. In 1481, Leonardo received perhaps his most important commission to date, from the monks of the monastery of San Donato a Scopeto, just outside Florence, for a large altarpiece depicting the adoration of the Magi. Leonardo worked on it for roughly a year, producing an underdrawing and partial underpainting of extraordinary ambition and complexity. Dozens of figures arranged in swirling, dynamic groups around the central image of the Virgin and Child, breaking dramatically from the more static, orderly compositions typical of earlier Florentine altarpieces. And then, in 1482, before the painting was completed, Leonardo left Florence entirely, abandoning the commission unfinished, exactly as he would abandon so many others throughout his life, leaving the panel behind him in Florence, where it remains today, unfinished in the Uffizi Gallery, a monument to both his genius and his restlessness. Why did Leonardo leave so many works incomplete? Historians have offered various explanations, and the truth is likely a combination of factors rather than any single cause. Contemporary accounts, including Vasari's, describe a mind so endlessly generative, so consumed by new questions and new ideas, that finishing any single project came to feel, for Leonardo, almost like a kind of premature closure, a foreclosing of possibilities that his restless intelligence found difficult to accept. He was, by his own admission in his notebooks, someone who found the process of investigation, of study, of endless refinement, more genuinely compelling than the finished product itself. There is also the simple, more mundane possibility that Leonardo, like many creative people across history, sometimes lost interest once the intellectual problem of a work, how to solve its composition, its perspective, its technical challenges, had been essentially worked out in his mind, leaving the physical labour of execution to feel like tedious repetition of something already understood. Whatever the precise mixture of causes, the pattern would define his entire working life, and it is worth sitting with this idea for a moment, because it offers a strangely comforting truth for anyone who has ever felt burdened by the pressure to finish everything they start. Leonardo da Vinci, arguably the most celebrated creative mind in human history, left the overwhelming majority of his projects incomplete, and history has not judged him for it. His unfinished sketches, his unfinished paintings, his notebooks full of ideas he never built, are treasured today not despite their incompleteness, but almost because of it. Windows into a mind that was always more interested in the next question than in closing the book on the last one. Year after year through this period of his late 20s and early 30s, Leonardo also struggled with the more mundane pressures common to any independent craftsman of his era. The need to secure paying commissions, to satisfy demanding patrons, to manage a small household of assistants and apprentices who depended on him for their own training and livelihood. Florence in these years was a competitive artistic marketplace, crowded with talented painters and sculptors all seeking the favour of the same relatively small circle of wealthy patrons, the Medici family foremost among them. Leonardo, for reasons that are not entirely clear from the surviving record, never became a favoured court painter of Lorenzo de' Medici, known to history as Lorenzo the Magnificent, the era's single most powerful patron of the arts in Florence, despite Lorenzo's generous support of many other artists of the period. Some historians speculate that Leonardo's slow working habits, already apparent in these years, made him a less attractive choice for a patron who valued reliability and speed. Others suggest that Leonardo's wide-ranging interests, his frequent digressions into engineering and scientific investigation at the expense of finishing commissioned paintings, simply did not fit the more narrowly focused image of a court painter that Lorenzo preferred to cultivate. Whatever the precise reason, the effect was that Leonardo, by his late 20s, found himself established as a recognized and admired talent within Florence, and yet somehow still on the margins of the most lucrative and prestigious patronage available in the city. Lesser spirits might have grown bitter at watching younger or less gifted contemporaries secure the choicest commissions. Leonardo, if his notebooks from this period are any guide, responded instead by turning his considerable energy towards self-directed study, filling early notebook pages with observations on mechanics, on the flight of birds, on the properties of light, an intellectual restlessness that, whatever its cost to his immediate career prospects, was quietly building the foundation of knowledge that would define the rest of his working life. By the time he departed for Milan in 1482, in search of a patron who might value the full breadth of his abilities rather than his painting alone, Leonardo was already, in the pages of his private notebooks, becoming something far larger than merely a promising Florentine painter who left too many commissions unfinished. In 1482, in search of new patronage, and, some historians suggest, in search of an environment that would value his engineering and inventive abilities as much as his painting, Leonardo left Florence for Milan, a city then ruled by the Sforza family, and specifically by the ambitious and powerful Duke Ludovico Sforza, known to history by his nickname Il Moro. It was Leonardo's own initiative, according to surviving evidence, that secured this new position. A letter, likely drafted by Leonardo himself, survives in which he presents himself to Ludovico Sforza, primarily as a military engineer, listing an extraordinary range of capabilities, the design of portable bridges, methods for draining moats and undermining fortresses, devices for hurling projectiles, plans for armoured vehicles, before mentioning, almost as an afterthought near the very end of the letter, that in times of peace he could also paint as well as any man living. This letter has become one of the most studied documents in art history, not only for what it tells us about Leonardo's self-presentation and ambition, but for the striking fact that a man who would go on to paint two of the most famous images ever created chose to introduce himself first and foremost as an engineer of war machines. Ludovico Sforza took him on, and Leonardo would remain in Milan for nearly 2 decades, the longest and in many respects most productive stretch of his adult life. Before continuing further into the story of Leonardo's years in Milan, it is worth pausing to consider what kind of man he actually was, day to day, beyond the list of his commissions and inventions. What did Leonardo look like? How did he spend an ordinary afternoon? What kind of company did he keep? Physically, according to contemporary descriptions and the handful of portraits and self-portraits believed to depict him, Leonardo was, in the words used repeatedly by those who knew him, and by early biographers like Vasari, a man of remarkable physical beauty. Tall, well-proportioned, with an elegant bearing that contemporaries frequently remarked upon. He's described as having had considerable physical strength in his youth, reportedly able to bend horseshoes with his bare hands, and a natural grace of movement and manner that made him, by every surviving account, an unusually charming presence in any company he kept. He cared, by the standards of his time, a great deal about his appearance and dress. Surviving household records and contemporary descriptions note his fondness for fine, brightly coloured clothing, including rose-coloured tunics of a length considered somewhat unconventional for the fashions of the period, and he is recorded as having kept his hair and beard carefully groomed and worn long, in a style that later became closely associated with his image in popular imagination, a striking contrast to many of his more soberly dressed contemporaries in the artistic profession. He never married, and left no children of his own, though as noted earlier he maintained close, lasting attachments to a series of young male companions and assistants throughout his adult life. The most famous and enduring of these relationships was with a boy named Gian Giacomo Caprotti, whom Leonardo took into his household in Milan in 1490, when the boy was about 10 years old, and who would remain associated with Leonardo in various capacities as assistant, companion, and eventually painter in his own right, for the rest of Leonardo's life, some 25 years. Leonardo gave the boy the affectionate, teasing nickname Salai, meaning little devil, a name recorded by Leonardo himself in his notebooks, along with an extensive and often exasperated catalogue of the boy's mischief, thefts, and misbehaviour, recorded with a tone that reads, across the centuries, as something very close to genuine paternal fondness mixed with real frustration. Later in life, Leonardo formed a similarly close bond with a young nobleman named Francesco Melzi, who joined his household as a teenager around 1506, and who would remain Leonardo's most devoted companion and eventual heir until the end of Leonardo's life, and who would be responsible, after Leonardo's death, for the careful preservation of his master's enormous body of notebooks and manuscripts, an act of devotion to which we owe the survival of most of what we know of Leonardo's inner mind today. Leonardo was, by every account, vegetarian, a highly unusual choice for a man of his era, when meat-eating was standard practice across all classes able to afford it. Contemporary letters and accounts, including reports later relayed by travellers who encountered stories about him, describe Leonardo's discomfort with the killing of animals and his habit, mentioned briefly earlier, of purchasing caged birds specifically in order to release them. His notebooks include passages expressing what reads, even across the centuries, as genuine moral unease at humanity's treatment of other living creatures, a sensitivity that seems directly connected to the tenderness toward animals observed in him even as a child in Vinci. His daily working habits, insofar as they can be reconstructed from his notebooks and the accounts of those who worked alongside him, appear to have been irregular and driven far more by intellectual obsession than by any fixed schedule. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe him sometimes rising before dawn to work uninterrupted for hours on a single problem, whether a painting, a mathematical diagram, or a mechanical design, and at other times abandoning his easel for days or even weeks at a stretch to pursue some entirely different question that had seized his attention, dissecting a corpse, studying the flow of water in a canal, observing the flight pattern of a bird. Contemporary witnesses, including the writer Matteo Bandello, who as a young novice observed Leonardo at work on the Last Supper in Milan, described him climbing his scaffold at dawn and remaining absorbed at his brush from sunrise to sunset without pausing to eat, and at other times arriving standing before the painting, adding 2 or 3 brush strokes over the course of several hours, and departing again, a pattern of intense concentration, followed by long contemplative pauses that some of his patrons, accustomed to more conventionally industrious artists, found genuinely maddening. He was, throughout his life, an obsessive keeper of notebooks, filling thousands of pages, of which somewhere around 7,000 survive today, scattered across collections in Milan, Paris, London, Madrid, Turin, and elsewhere, with a staggering range of material: anatomical studies drawn from direct dissection, engineering designs for bridges, weapons and flying machines, observations on the behavior of water and the formation of geological strata, botanical studies of plant growth, mathematical investigations, personal shopping lists, records of money owed to and by him, and fragments of fables and riddles he composed apparently for his own amusement. he wrote in a distinctive mirror script, moving from right to left across the page in reversed letters that can only be easily read when held up to a mirror, a practice historians generally attribute to the simple, practical convenience of a left-handed writer avoiding smearing wet ink across the page as his hand moved, rather than to any deliberate attempt at secrecy, though the effect has certainly added to the aura of mystery that surrounds him in popular imagination. He loved music and was, by multiple contemporary accounts, a gifted improviser and singer. Skilled on a silver lyre he had reportedly designed himself in the shape of a horse's skull, a detail recorded by Vasari that speaks to Leonardo's characteristic habit of merging artistic and inventive impulses even in his recreational pursuits. He enjoyed elaborate riddles, prophecies, and practical jokes, a playful theatrical side of his character reflected in the festival designs and courtly entertainments he was frequently called upon to create for his patrons in Milan, and later in life, elaborate mechanical stage sets, allegorical pageants, and puzzle contraptions that delighted the noble courts he served. He was, in short, a man who moved through the world with an unusual and captivating combination of grace, curiosity, tenderness, and almost unbearable restlessness, a man for whom the boundary between art, science, philosophy, and simple play seems never to have existed at all. His notebooks also reveal a surprisingly meticulous side to his character when it came to household management, a detail that softens, in a very human way, the popular image of Leonardo as a purely dreamy, otherworldly genius. He kept careful, sometimes almost obsessive records of household expenses, the cost of shoes purchased for Salai, the price of paper and pigments, small loans made to assistants and later repaid, or, in some cases, not repaid, accompanied by Leonardo's own wry notations of frustration. He recorded, in one frequently cited passage, a detailed and clearly exasperated list of Salai's misdeeds over a period of months, thefts of small sums of money and minor household items, calculated down to the last coin, a passage that reads, across 5 centuries, less like the dry record of a landlord and more like the affectionately weary complaint of someone who loved a difficult, high-spirited young person very much despite themselves. He was also, by several contemporary accounts, an engaging and generous conversationalist, known to entertain fellow artists, visiting scholars, and members of the courts he served with witty remarks, riddles, and observations drawn from his endless private study of the natural world. Visitors to his later household in France recorded him discoursing easily on subjects ranging from anatomy to hydraulics to the principles of perspective, apparently as comfortable holding forth on any one of these topics as he was demonstrating a new mechanical toy or performing on his lyre. He maintained throughout his adult life a genuine fondness for elegant clothing and fine fabric, and surviving inventories of his personal effects list items of notable quality and cost, a small, telling detail suggesting that whatever ascetic intensity characterized his working habits, Leonardo also took real, uncomplicated pleasure in beauty of every kind, including the simple beauty of a well-made garment. Contemporaries also described him as unusually gentle and patient with his students and assistants, teaching not through harsh correction, but through careful demonstration and encouragement, a manner of instruction that, combined with his genuine warmth, appears to have inspired real loyalty among those who worked closely with him across the decades, from the mischievous young Salai to the devoted Melzi, both of whom remained bound to him in different ways for the whole of their working lives. Leonardo's arrival in Milan in 1482 marked the beginning of what would become, in retrospect, the richest and most productive period of his working life. Under the patronage of Ludovico Sforza, Leonardo was given remarkable freedom to pursue his wide-ranging interests. He served the Sforza court not only as a painter, but as an engineer, an architect, a designer of festivals and theatrical spectacles, and, for a substantial period of years, as the lead designer on an enormous bronze equestrian monument intended to honor Ludovico's father, Francesco Sforza, the founder of the ruling dynasty. This monument, which came to be known as the Gran Cavallo, occupied Leonardo for well over a decade. He produced hundreds of studies of horses in motion, studying their anatomy with the same intensity he brought to human dissection, and eventually designed a full-scale clay model, reportedly some 24 feet tall, an engineering undertaking of enormous ambition that, had it been successfully cast in bronze, would have been the largest equestrian statue in the world, surpassing anything created since antiquity. The clay model was completed and put on public display in Milan in 1493, drawing admiration from visitors and poets who saw it. But the bronze needed to cast the final statue, some 70 tons of metal that Leonardo had spent years planning how to pour in a single continuous casting, using an innovative technique of his own design, was instead diverted by Ludovico Sforza to the manufacture of cannons, as Milan found itself drawn into the escalating military conflicts of the period. The great horse was never cast. In 1499, when French forces invaded Milan and toppled the Sforza regime, French soldiers, according to multiple contemporary accounts, used the abandoned clay model for target practice, and what remained eventually crumbled and was lost entirely, leaving behind only Leonardo's exquisite preparatory drawings as testimony to what might have been one of the great sculptural achievements of the Renaissance. It was also during these Milan years, beginning around 1495, that Leonardo undertook the commission that would produce one of the most famous paintings in the history of art, The Last Supper, painted directly onto the wall of the dining hall, or refectory, of the monastery of Santa Maria del Grazie, at the request of Ludovico Sforza. Rather than using the traditional and durable technique of true fresco, which requires painting quickly into wet plaster before it dries, a method that suited Leonardo's temperament poorly, given his preference for slow, layered refinement. He instead experimented with an oil and tempera mixture applied directly to dry plaster, a technique that allowed him the careful, deliberate working method he required, but which tragically proved far less stable over time than traditional fresco. Within decades of its completion, the painting had already begun to deteriorate, flaking and fading due to Leonardo's technical experimentation, a slow decay that has continued across the centuries and that modern conservationists continue to battle today through careful, painstaking restoration efforts. Despite this physical fragility, the composition itself represented a genuine artistic revolution. Where earlier depictions of the Last Supper had typically arranged Christ and his 12 apostles in a static, evenly spaced row, Leonardo instead captured the single dramatic moment immediately after Christ announces that one of those present will betray him, organizing the 12 apostles into 4 dynamic groups of 3, each reacting with a distinct and psychologically individualized mixture of shock, denial, anger, and grief, their gestures and expressions rippling outward from the calm, central figure of Christ like waves from a stone dropped in water. It was, and remains, a masterclass in capturing not merely physical appearance, but the inner emotional and psychological life of a moment, an achievement that influenced generations of artists who came after him, and that remains, more than 5 centuries later, one of the most reproduced and recognized images in the history of human art. It was also in Milan, though the precise dating remains debated among scholars, that Leonardo appears to have deepened significantly his study of human anatomy, gaining access through connections with the medical faculty of the University of Pavia to perform direct human dissections, an activity that placed him, quite literally, ahead of the medical science of his own era. Working primarily with a physician and anatomist named Marcantonio della Torre, Leonardo would go on, over the following 2 decades of his life, to dissect by his own written account some 30 human corpses, along with numerous animals, producing anatomical drawings of a precision and accuracy that would not be equalled in published medical literature for another 200 years. He documented the layered structure of muscles, the mechanics of the heart's 4 chambers, and the branching pattern of blood vessels, in some cases arriving at observations, including early insights into the workings of heart valves and the process of arteriosclerosis, that anticipated discoveries not formally credited to medical science until centuries later, that these anatomical studies, filling hundreds of pages of exquisite, scientifically precise drawings, remained essentially unpublished and unknown to the wider world of medicine until they were rediscovered by scholars long after his death represents one of the great quiet tragedies of Leonardo's career, a body of scientific knowledge that might have transformed the medical understanding of his era had it reached beyond the private pages of his own notebooks. Leonardo could not have known, as he filled page after page with these private studies, drawn for no one's eyes but his own, that centuries later they would be recognized as among the most important scientific documents ever produced by a single individual. But he continued, year after year, driven by nothing but his own insatiable need to understand. Beyond the Gran Cavallo, the Last Supper, and his anatomical investigations, the Milan years also produced 2 further paintings that reveal a great deal about Leonardo's evolving artistic language during this period. The first, known as the Virgin of the Rocks, exists today in 2 versions, one in the Louvre and one in London's National Gallery, a duplication that has puzzled and fascinated scholars for generations, most likely explained by a dispute over payment with the confraternity that had originally commissioned the work, leading Leonardo and his workshop to produce a second version some years after the first. Both paintings depict the Virgin Mary, the infant Christ, the infant John the Baptist, and an angel, arranged within a strange grotto-like rocky landscape, rendered with the same geological precision that characterized Leonardo's private scientific notebooks, stalactites, and layered rock formations observed with the eye of a naturalist even within a devotional religious scene, a fusion of scientific observation and spiritual subject matter entirely characteristic of his particular genius. The second major portrait of these years, known today as Lady with an Ermine, depicts Cecilia Gallerani, a young woman who was for a period the mistress of Duke Ludovico Sforza himself. The painting is remarkable for its psychological immediacy. Cecilia's head turned as though she has just glanced towards someone entering the room, her hand resting with startling naturalism on the sleek white ermine cradled in her arms, an effect of captured living motion that stood in dramatic contrast to the more formal, static profile portraits that had dominated Italian portraiture for generations before it. Together with the Mona Lisa painted years later, this portrait represents one of the clearest demonstrations of how thoroughly Leonardo transformed the very concept of what a painted portrait could achieve, moving the genre away from simple documentation of appearance and towards something closer to the capture of a living, thinking, feeling human presence. Life at the Sforza court, beyond these individual commissions, also called upon Leonardo's considerable talents as a designer of spectacle and celebration. Court records from this period describe his involvement in designing elaborate theatrical productions and festival decorations, including a legendary production staged in 1490 known as the Feast of Paradise, created to celebrate the wedding of Ludovico's nephew, for which Leonardo designed a revolving mechanical set representing the movement of the planets, accompanied by actors dressed as figures from classical mythology, descending to bestow gifts upon the wedding party, a fusion of theatrical artistry and mechanical engineering that delighted the Milanese court, and further cemented Leonardo's reputation as a figure whose talents extended well beyond the painter's brush. In the autumn of 1499, the stable world Leonardo had inhabited for nearly 2 decades came apart with startling speed. French forces under King Louis XII invaded the Duchy of Milan, and Ludovico Sforza's government collapsed within weeks. Sforza himself fled, was eventually captured, and would spend the remaining years of his life imprisoned in France, dying in captivity in 1508, a sobering fall for a ruler who had once commanded one of the wealthiest courts in Italy. For Leonardo, now 47 years old, the collapse of Milan meant the sudden loss of stable patronage after nearly 2 decades in one place, and the beginning of what biographers often describe as his wandering years, a period of roughly a decade and a half during which he moved between several cities and served several different patrons, never again settling for as long a stretch as he had enjoyed in Milan under Sforza. He returned first to Florence, briefly, then travelled to Venice, where the Venetian government consulted him regarding fortifications against the threat of Ottoman invasion, before returning again to Florence by the spring of 1500. He would spend much of the following several years moving between Florence and various commissions, including a remarkable and, in retrospect, almost surreal interlude beginning in 1502, when Leonardo entered the service of Cesare Borgia, the ruthless and ambitious son of Pope Alexander VI, who was in the process of carving out a personal territorial state across central Italy through a campaign combining military force and considerable brutality. For roughly a year, Leonardo served Borgia as a military engineer and cartographer, surveying fortifications and producing remarkably accurate maps of the towns under Borgia's control, an unsettling but historically significant episode that placed the gentle, animal-loving artist in close proximity to one of the most feared and violent political figures of his age. It was during this period that Leonardo crossed paths professionally with the political writer Niccolò Machiavelli, then serving as a Florentine diplomat observing Borgia's court, a meeting between 2 of the sharpest minds of the Renaissance that has fascinated historians ever since, though the surviving record of their actual interactions remains frustratingly sparse. By 1503, Leonardo had returned once more to Florence, where the city government commissioned him to paint a monumental battle scene, the Battle of Anghiari, for the Great Council Hall of the Palazzo Vecchio, a project that would place him, remarkably, in direct competition with a much younger rising star of Florentine art, the sculptor and painter Michelangelo Buonarroti, who was commissioned around the same time to paint a companion battle scene, the Battle of Cassina, for the opposite wall of the same hall. The rivalry between the 2 men, separated in age by nearly a quarter-century, and possessed of famously different temperaments, Leonardo elegant, deliberate and courtly, Michelangelo intense, solitary, and famously difficult, became one of the most talked about artistic contests of the Renaissance. Neither battle scene, as it happened, would survive to the present day. Michelangelo left his Florentine cartoon and preliminary designs unfinished when he was summoned to Rome by the newly elected Pope Julius II. Leonardo, working once again with an experimental technique in his attempt to paint directly on the wall, using an oil-based method he hoped would allow the slow, careful revision he preferred, saw the paint begin to run and blister even as he worked, and the project was eventually abandoned, later painted over entirely when the hall was renovated decades afterward, leaving behind only Leonardo's preparatory drawings and copies made by other artists, including a particularly vivid copy attributed to the young Peter Paul Rubens working from earlier sketches, as evidence of what was once considered among the most dynamic and violent compositions ever conceived for a Renaissance wall. It was also during this Florentine period, beginning probably around 1503, that Leonardo began work on the small portrait that would eventually become the single most famous painting in the world, the Mona Lisa. The identity of the woman depicted in what art historians formally call the portrait of Lisa Gherardini has been debated for centuries, though the most widely accepted scholarly conclusion, supported by a marginal note discovered in 2005 in a book once owned by a Florentine official acquainted with Leonardo's father, identifies her as Lisa del Giocondo, born Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. The commission in this reading was a relatively ordinary one for its time, a merchant husband commemorating his wife, likely to mark a significant family event, possibly the birth of a child or the purchase of a new home. What Leonardo made of this ordinary commission was anything but ordinary. Working with a technique he had spent decades refining, a subtle blending of light and shadow known by the Italian term sfumato, in which colour transitions are so gradual and smoke-like that no hard boundary lines are visible at all, Leonardo produced a portrait of extraordinary psychological depth. The famous half-smile, subtle enough that it seems to shift depending on where the viewer's eye happens to rest, on the mouth or on the eyes, has captivated observers for 5 centuries precisely because it resists any single, fixed interpretation, appearing warm in one glance and enigmatic, even melancholy in the next. Leonardo's technical mastery extended well beyond the famous smile itself. The landscape behind the sitter, a strange, dreamlike composition of winding rivers, distant mountains and a bridge, appears to shift in perspective and atmospheric depth between the left and right sides of the painting, contributing to the painting's subtle, almost hypnotic sense of instability. His use of extremely thin, translucent layers of oil paint, applied one over another in dozens of nearly invisible glazes, created an unprecedented sense of soft, living depth in the rendering of skin, an effect that later technical and infrared analysis of the painting has confirmed involved an astonishing patience and precision, layers of paint measured in some areas in mere microns of thickness. What is perhaps most remarkable about this painting's story, however, is that Leonardo, in a pattern entirely consistent with the rest of his career, never delivered it to the client who had commissioned it. He kept the painting with him instead, carrying it with him through the remaining years of his travels, continuing to refine it, adding subtle adjustments for as long as 16 years after he had first begun it, according to most scholarly estimates, still working on it, by some accounts, in the very final years of his life. It was, in this sense, less a commissioned portrait than a private, ongoing meditation on the limits of what a painted surface could be made to express, a problem Leonardo seems never to have considered fully solved, and therefore never considered fully finished. The painting would eventually travel with him to France, where, after his death, it entered the collection of the French king, and it remains there today, in the Louvre Museum in Paris, viewed by millions of visitors each year, protected behind glass, drawing crowds that gather simply to stand for a moment before that same quiet, ambiguous smile that Leonardo spent so many patient years refining. Consider, for a moment, the modest scale of this object that has come to occupy such an outsized place in the world's imagination. The panel itself measures barely 30 inches in height, painted on a single piece of poplar wood, small enough that a visitor encountering it for the first time is often surprised by how intimate, even unassuming, it appears in person compared to its towering cultural reputation. Its fame today owes something not only to its own considerable merits, but to the accumulated weight of history around it, including the sensational theft of 1911, when an Italian handyman employed at the Louvre simply lifted the painting from the wall and walked out with it hidden beneath his coat, an event that placed the painting on the front pages of newspapers around the world for the more than 2 years it remained missing, and that transformed what had already been a celebrated masterpiece among connoisseurs into a genuine object of global popular fascination, a fame from which it has never receded. What makes the painting endure as a serious artistic achievement, beyond the accidents of history that amplified its celebrity, is the sheer technical patience Leonardo brought to its creation. Modern conservation analysis has identified as many as 30 separate translucent layers of paint in some passages of the work, each layer so thin that it would have required days or weeks of drying time before the next could be applied, a working method that helps explain why Leonardo, who habitually carried the panel with him across his later travels through Italy and eventually into France, may genuinely have continued adjusting it, a glaze here, a subtle correction there, for the better part of a decade and a half, never quite reaching the point where his own exacting standards would allow him to call it finished. Alongside his painting, and in many respects consuming even more of his time and attention across his lifetime, Leonardo pursued an extraordinary range of scientific and engineering investigations, documented across the thousands of surviving pages of his notebooks, that place him, in the eyes of many historians of science, among the most remarkable observational minds in human history, centuries ahead of the formal scientific establishment of his own era. His studies of human flight occupied him intermittently across several decades, filling notebooks with detailed studies of bird anatomy, wing structure, and the mechanics of air resistance, culminating in designs for various flying machines, including an ornithopter intended to mimic the flapping motion of birds' wings, and, in his later years, sketches that some historians interpret as an early conceptual ancestor of the modern parachute, and even in a famous sketch sometimes called the aerial screw, a device whose spiral design has led some later commentators to draw comparisons, however loose and anachronistic, to the much later invention of the helicopter. None of Leonardo's flying machines were ever successfully built or flown in his own lifetime, and modern engineering analysis has confirmed that most, given the materials and power sources available in the 15th century, could not have achieved sustained flight as designed. But the underlying scientific instinct, that the mechanics of flight could be understood by careful observation of birds and rigorous application of physical principles, anticipated by nearly 4 centuries the fundamental approach that would eventually lead to the successful powered flight achieved by the Wright brothers in 1903. His studies of water, a subject that fascinated him throughout his life, filled entire notebooks with observations on the movement of currents, the formation of eddies and turbulence, and the design of canals, locks, and irrigation systems, studies that combined rigorous empirical observation with an almost poetic sensitivity to water's constantly shifting forms, reflected also in the swirling, turbulent backgrounds of some of his later paintings and drawings. His anatomical investigations, discussed briefly earlier, extended into architecture and engineering with equal intensity. He designed proposals for an ideal city with separated levels for pedestrian and cart traffic to reduce congestion and improve sanitation, a concept of urban planning startlingly ahead of its time. He designed war machines of considerable ingenuity, including an early conceptual armoured vehicle, a kind of covered, wheeled fighting platform bristling with cannon, along with designs for improved crossbows, siege equipment, and fortification systems, reflecting the practical military engineering skills he had first advertised to Ludovico Sforza decades earlier. He also maintained across his notebooks a persistent fascination with mathematics and geometry, collaborating in the 1490s in Milan with the mathematician Luca Pacioli, for whose published treatise on proportion, De Divina Proportione, Leonardo produced a remarkable series of illustrations depicting geometric solids, work that reflected his belief, shared with many thinkers of his era, that mathematical proportion underlay the fundamental structure of beauty itself, a belief perhaps most famously expressed in his well-known drawing known as the Vitruvian Man, depicting a male figure inscribed within both a circle and a square, illustrating principles of human proportion described centuries earlier by the Roman architect Vitruvius, a drawing that has become, in the centuries since, perhaps the single most recognizable emblem of Renaissance thought itself, reproduced endlessly as a symbol of the union between art, science, and the human form. What unified all of these investigations across such an astonishing range of subjects was not any single scientific theory or system, since Leonardo, denied formal training, never developed his observations into the kind of systematic, published scientific framework that later figures like Galileo or Newton would achieve. Instead, what unified Leonardo's work was a consistent method, careful, patient, direct observation of the natural world, recorded with extraordinary visual precision, followed by an equally patient effort to understand the underlying mechanical or mathematical principles at work. It was, in essence, a form of scientific thinking centuries ahead of the formal scientific revolution that would not fully take hold in Europe until the following century, practiced almost entirely in private, in notebooks that very few people during Leonardo's own lifetime ever had the opportunity to see. This would prove to be, in some ways, the great quiet sorrow of Leonardo's intellectual life. He suspected, and stated explicitly in his own writing, that he intended eventually to organize his scattered notes into formal treatises on anatomy, on water, on painting, on mechanics, that could be shared with the wider world. He never completed this task. The notebooks remained exactly that, notebooks, private and unpublished, scattered at his death among his heirs, and it would be centuries before scholars, painstakingly reassembling and translating these scattered pages, would come to fully appreciate the scope of what Leonardo had actually understood, alone, in the quiet of his own study, centuries before the rest of the world caught up. Consider for a moment the sheer physical labour involved in producing these notebooks. Across a working life of roughly 4 decades, Leonardo is estimated to have filled somewhere between 20 and 30,000 pages with writing and drawing, of which the surviving 7,000 or so represent perhaps only a fraction of the original total, the rest lost, destroyed, or still undiscovered in private collections. Each page was produced by hand, in the flickering light of candles or oil lamps for any work done after dark, using ink made from oak galls and iron salts, ground and mixed according to recipes he sometimes recorded alongside his scientific observations. He drew with metal point, red and black chalk, and pen and ink, often combining several techniques on a single page, layering diagrams, written notes, and small marginal sketches with the density that can make his pages, to modern eyes accustomed to more orderly documentation, appear almost chaotic. Thoughts overlapping thoughts, a mind visibly moving faster than the hand attempting to record it. His investigations into optics offer a particularly vivid example of this method in action. Fascinated by the mechanics of vision itself, Leonardo conducted careful experiments with light, passing through small apertures into darkened rooms, observing and recording the inverted images this produced, essentially documenting the principles behind what would later be formalized as the camera obscura, a foundational concept in the eventual development of photography centuries later. He studied the way light diffuses through mist and distance, translating these observations directly into the atmospheric perspective visible in the softened blue-tinged mountains receding into the background of paintings like the Mona Lisa, a technique in which objects farther from the viewer are rendered not only smaller but softer in outline and cooler in color, mimicking the actual optical experience of looking across a great distance through humid air, an effect earlier painters had approximated through instinct, but which Leonardo grounded in genuine documented observation of how light itself behaves. His investigations into the human body extended well beyond static anatomical structure into an interest in physiology and function that anticipated, in striking ways, concepts not formally established in medical science for centuries. He conducted experiments attempting to understand the mechanics of the heart valves, using glass models and colored liquids to observe how blood flow created the swirling patterns he had observed in actual dissection, correctly identifying aspects of the way blood moves through the heart's chambers that would not be confirmed through modern fluid dynamic studies until the 20th century. He studied the aging process by comparing dissections of an elderly man, whom he reportedly encountered and spoke with only hours before the man's death in a Florentine hospital, with the corresponding dissection of a young child, in an early and remarkably deliberate attempt to understand physiological change across the human lifespan through direct comparative observation rather than inherited assumption. It is worth pausing to imagine what it must have felt like for Leonardo himself to hold this scope of private knowledge that the wider world had no access to. He understood, more clearly than the physicians of his era, how the human heart functioned. He understood, more clearly than the engineers of his era, how water moved and how flight might one day be achieved. He understood, more clearly than the natural philosophers of his era, how mountains had risen from ancient seas, and nearly all of it remained locked within the pages of notebooks written in mirror script, read by no one but himself, at least during the whole span of his own lifetime. There is something both magnificent and quietly melancholy in this image. One man, alone at a writing table by candlelight, patiently working out truths about the world that the rest of humanity would not catch up to for centuries, simply because he could not stop himself from looking closely and asking why. Leonardo's life was not without conflict, though the nature of the challenges he faced tended to be professional and intellectual rather than dangerously political, at least compared to some of his contemporaries. The most significant and enduring rivalry of his career, touched on briefly earlier, was with Michelangelo, nearly 23 years his junior, whose fierce, muscular, emotionally intense style of sculpture and painting stood in sharp contrast to Leonardo's more subtle, atmospheric, and intellectually curious approach. The two men, by most contemporary accounts, did not particularly like each other. Michelangelo, known throughout his life for a prickly, often combative temperament, is recorded in one famous anecdote as having publicly mocked Leonardo in the street, reportedly needling him over his unfinished bronze horse project in Milan, a jab clearly intended to wound. Leonardo, for his part, is recorded in his own notebooks making somewhat dismissive comments about sculpture as an art form generally, in comparison to painting, comments that, given the timing and context, appear to reflect at least some of the professional tension between the two men, even if Leonardo's writing on the subject reads more as a broader aesthetic argument than a direct personal attack. Beyond this rivalry, Leonardo also experienced, across various points in his career, the more mundane frustrations common to artists dependent on the patronage of powerful and sometimes fickle rulers, delayed payments, unfulfilled commissions, and the general instability of political life in a fractured Italy, repeatedly torn by war between competing city-states, foreign invaders, and shifting alliances. His years of service to Cesare Borgia placed him, however briefly, in association with one of the most feared and ruthless political figures of the era, and though there is no evidence Leonardo personally suffered violence or threat during this period, the collapse of Borgia's fortunes not long after, and the broader instability of Italian politics throughout Leonardo's working life, meant that no patron, however powerful, could offer him truly permanent security. Perhaps the deepest and most lasting source of conflict in Leonardo's life, however, was internal rather than external. The persistent tension between the astonishing scope of his ambitions and the limits of what any single human life, however long, however brilliant, could actually accomplish. He himself seems to have felt this tension acutely in his later years, according to accounts and reflections recorded in his own notebooks, expressing something close to regret over the sheer number of projects left incomplete, investigations left unpublished, ideas left unrealized. It is a gentle, human note running beneath the extraordinary achievements of his life, a reminder that even the broadest and most brilliant of minds must eventually make peace with its own limitations. There is also the matter, touched on briefly earlier, of Leonardo's complicated relationship with his own family in Florence, a source of quiet but persistent friction across much of his adult life. His father, Ser Piero, went on, across his 4 marriages, to father a total of 12 legitimate children, sons who, unlike Leonardo, held full legal rights of inheritance under Florentine law. When Ser Piero died in 1504 without leaving a formal will addressing the disposition of his estate, a bitter dispute arose between Leonardo and his half-brothers over their father's property, a dispute in which Leonardo, as an illegitimate son, found himself legally disadvantaged despite being, by that point in his life, one of the most celebrated artists in all of Italy. A similar and even more prolonged dispute arose several years later, following the death of Leonardo's uncle Francesco, this same uncle who had shared with him a love of the natural world during his boyhood years in Vinci, and who had left the bulk of his own modest property directly to Leonardo, a bequest his half-brothers again contested in the courts, dragging the matter out for years. These disputes, though never physically dangerous in the way his brief service to Cesare Borgia might have been, nonetheless caused Leonardo genuine and prolonged frustration, a reminder that the same circumstance of birth that had, in denying him a conventional education, freed his mind to wander so productively across so many fields, also followed him, in these more painful legal and financial matters, for the whole of his life. In 1513, following the death of Pope Julius II and shifting political fortunes in Florence and Milan, Leonardo, now 61 years old, travelled to Rome, taking up residence in the Vatican under the patronage of Giuliano de' Medici. brother of the newly elected Pope Leo X. This Roman period, lasting roughly 3 years, proved less artistically productive than his earlier years, with much of his time apparently devoted to scientific investigation, particularly optics and mirrors, rather than major painting commissions, and there is some evidence in his correspondence suggesting a degree of professional frustration during this stretch, as the artistic spotlight in Rome at the time was dominated overwhelmingly by the younger Michelangelo and by the rapidly rising painter Raphael, both of whom received the major papal commissions of the period, leaving Leonardo, by comparison, somewhat sidelined in the city that was then the artistic centre of the Western world. It was in this context, in 1516, that Leonardo, now 64 years old, received and accepted an invitation of considerable significance from the young King of France, Francis I, a passionate admirer of Italian Renaissance art and culture who had recently taken the throne and was eager to bring the glory of Italian artistic achievement to his own court. The king offered Leonardo the title of first painter, engineer, and architect to the king, along with a generous pension and, remarkably, a comfortable residence of his own at the manor house of Clos-Lucé, in the town of Amboise in the Loire Valley, connected by an underground passage directly to the royal chateau, allowing the aging artist and the young king to visit one another freely and, according to several accounts, to spend long hours together in conversation. The king reportedly regarding Leonardo, then in his 60s, with something approaching filial devotion and awe. Leonardo made the long journey from Italy to France in 1516, accompanied by his devoted young companion Francesco Melzi and by a household servant, bringing with him, carefully packed for the journey across the Alps, a small number of his most treasured paintings, including, almost certainly, the still unfinished Mona Lisa, along with his enormous collection of notebooks and manuscripts, the accumulated record of a lifetime of observation that he seems to have regarded in these final years as perhaps his most valuable and enduring legacy. At Clos-Lucé, in the gentle wooded landscape of the Loire Valley, Leonardo spent the final 3 years of his life, no longer expected by his royal patron to produce major new painted works, given the visible decline of his physical strength, but rather permitted, with the king's generous and evidently genuine affection, to spend his remaining time largely as he wished, organizing his notebooks, continuing his scientific investigations, offering advice on architectural and engineering projects for the French court, including designs for a new royal residence and elaborate plans for diverting and canalizing local rivers, and designing elaborate courtly festivals and pageants of the kind that had delighted his patrons throughout his career. By this point in his life, Leonardo's health had begun to decline in earnest. Contemporary accounts and later scholarly analysis of surviving portraits believed to depict him in these final years suggest he suffered from some degree of paralysis affecting his right hand, a condition modern medical historians have speculated, based on the available descriptions, may have resulted from a stroke, though the precise cause cannot be determined with certainty from the surviving historical record. Since Leonardo was left-handed, this paralysis of his right hand, while limiting, did not entirely prevent him from continuing to draw and write with his dominant left hand, though contemporary visitors to his workshop in these final years noted that he could no longer paint with his former ease and precision, and that much of the physical execution of any remaining artistic projects had, by necessity, passed to the hands of his loyal assistant Melzi. A Venetian visitor to Leonardo's household at Clos-Lucé in the autumn of 1517, a cleric named Antonio de Beatis travelling in the retinue of a cardinal, left behind one of the most valuable surviving eyewitness descriptions of the aging artist, recording in his travel diary that he'd been shown 3 paintings by the elderly Florentine master, including a portrait of a Florentine lady, almost certainly the Mona Lisa, along with a painting of St. John the Baptist and another depicting the Virgin and Child with St. Anne, both of which Leonardo had also carried with him from Italy and continued even in these final years to quietly refine. De Beatus noted with evident sympathy that the paralysis affecting Leonardo's right hand meant no further work of real excellence could be expected from him. Yet he described the elderly artist as still full of intellectual vigour, still eager to discuss his ideas, still, in the visitor's own words, a man of extraordinary knowledge across many subjects, a description that captures the poignant reality of these final years, a body increasingly limited, a mind still burning as brightly as ever. Year after year in this quiet French countryside, so far in every sense from the hill town of Vinci where his life had begun, Leonardo continued, as he always had, to fill pages with questions. He organized his papers, he revised old anatomical drawings, he continued to sketch, in these final months of his life, a series of extraordinary and haunting drawings known collectively as the Deluge series, depicting apocalyptic visions of storms, floods, and swirling destructive water, images that art historians and psychologists have long puzzled over, some interpreting them as a kind of meditation on mortality and the overwhelming, uncontrollable power of the natural forces Leonardo had spent his entire life trying patiently to understand and, in his engineering designs, to master. By the spring of 1519, Leonardo, now 67 years old, an advanced age by the standards of the 16th century, was clearly failing. Francesco Melzi, who remained constantly at his side throughout these final weeks, would later write, in a letter informing Leonardo's family in Florence of his death, an account that remains one of the most important and moving sources for the details of Leonardo's final days. According to Melzi's account, Leonardo, sensing that his death was approaching, arranged his affairs with the same careful, deliberate attention he had brought to every other undertaking of his life. He drafted a formal will, dated the 23rd of April, 1519, carefully distributing his possessions, his precious manuscripts and notebooks, along with his instruments and his library, left to the devoted Francesco Melzi, who was also named his executor. His vineyard near Milan was divided between his servant Battista de Villanis and his longtime companion Salai, who had by this point established his own household and career as a painter, having left Leonardo's direct daily service some years earlier but remaining connected to him. Provisions were also made for his half-brothers back in Florence, with whom Leonardo had endured a long and difficult legal dispute over their father's estate following Ser Piero's death in 1504, and for a woman named Caterina, who some historians believe may have been Leonardo's own mother, who appears to have spent her final days, and possibly died, in Leonardo's household in Milan many years earlier, in 1493, an emotionally significant detail suggesting that whatever the complications of his birth, Leonardo may have found a way, in adulthood, to bring his mother back into his life and care for her in her own final years. The will also included careful and specific instructions regarding Leonardo's funeral, requesting that 60 candle-bearers accompany his body and specifying masses to be said at several churches in the city of Amboise, along with charitable donations to be distributed to the poor, details reflecting both the conventional religious piety expected of the period and, some historians suggest, a genuine personal faith that persisted alongside Leonardo's famously independent and empirically minded intellect. According to the traditional account, Drawn primarily from Vasari's later biography, though its precise details have been debated by scholars in the centuries since, Leonardo died on the 2nd of May, 1519, at Clos-Lucé, with King Francis himself present at his bedside, cradling the dying artist's head in his arms as he passed. This particular detail, the king personally present at the moment of death, has become one of the most famous and beloved images associated with Leonardo's biography, immortalized centuries later in a celebrated painting by the French artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. Though modern historians note that royal court records place King Francis at a different location on the actual date of Leonardo's death, suggesting this touching scene, however emotionally satisfying, may be more legend than literal fact, likely an embellishment added by Vasari to underscore the depth of royal esteem in which Leonardo had come to be held. What can be said with more confidence, based on Melzi's own contemporary letter, written in the raw immediacy of grief to Leonardo's Florentine relatives, is this: Leonardo died peacefully, attended by his household, having received the sacraments of the Church in the days prior, his affairs carefully arranged, his most treasured possessions, his notebooks and his final paintings, placed in the trusted hands of the devoted young companion who had shared the last 13 years of his life. Melzi wrote to Leonardo's brothers that he had lost a father in Leonardo, and that his grief was as great as any felt for the loss of a natural parent, words that speak, across 5 centuries, to the depth of genuine affection Leonardo inspired in those closest to him. Leonardo was buried according to his wishes in the cloister of the church of Saint Florentin at the Chateau of Amboise. The precise location of his grave was lost during the religious wars and revolutionary upheavals that swept through France in the centuries that followed, the church itself eventually falling into ruin and being partially demolished. In the 19th century, an excavation of the site uncovered bones believed, though not proven with absolute scientific certainty, to be Leonardo's remains, based on their location and associated fragments of an inscription bearing his name. These remains were reinterred in 1874 in the chapel of Saint Hubert, within the grounds of the Chateau of Amboise, where a modest tomb, marked simply with his name, remains today, visited by admirers from around the world. In the years immediately following Leonardo's death, his legacy passed, in the most literal sense, into the careful hands of Francesco Melzi, who returned to his family estate near Milan carrying the extraordinary collection of Leonardo's notebooks and manuscripts, along with the paintings that had remained in Leonardo's own possession at the time of his death, including the Mona Lisa, which King Francis had already, before Leonardo's death, acquired for the French royal collection, where it would remain for the rest of its history, eventually passing into the national collection of France following the French Revolution, and finding its permanent home in the Louvre. Melzi devoted much of the remainder of his own long life to the careful preservation and organization of Leonardo's papers, and it was from these papers, decades after Leonardo's death, that Melzi compiled and arranged a manuscript that would eventually be published, long after both men were gone, as Leonardo's treatise on painting, a partial realization, however incomplete, of the systematic written legacy Leonardo himself had always intended, but never managed to finish during his own lifetime. Following Melzi's death, however, the collection of notebooks was scattered among various heirs and subsequent owners, sold, divided and dispersed across Europe over the following centuries, a process that saw some pages lost entirely and others separated from their original sequence, a scattering that modern scholars continue to work at reconstructing today, piecing together, page by page, the record of a mind that had tried, in fragmentary private notes to understand nearly everything. The immediate artistic influence of Leonardo's innovations was profound and lasting. His techniques of sfumato and atmospheric perspective, his psychologically dynamic approach to composition, demonstrated so powerfully in The Last Supper, and his patient, scientifically grounded study of human anatomy and natural form shaped the entire subsequent development of European painting, influencing artists across Italy and beyond for generations. Raphael, working in Florence and later Rome during the same years Leonardo was active, absorbed and adapted many of his compositional innovations. The broader tradition of High Renaissance and later Baroque painting owes an incalculable debt to techniques Leonardo pioneered, often working largely alone through decades of patient private experimentation. But it is in the realm of scientific and engineering thought that Leonardo's ultimate legacy has proven, in some ways, even more remarkable, precisely because it remained hidden for so long. When his anatomical and scientific notebooks were finally rediscovered, transcribed and studied in detail by scholars beginning in the 19th century, and continuing with increasing intensity through the 20th and 21st centuries, historians of science came to recognize that Leonardo had anticipated, through direct observation alone, without benefit of the formal experimental and mathematical apparatus that later scientists would develop, an extraordinary range of insights into anatomy, hydraulics, optics, geology, and mechanics that would not be independently confirmed by the formal scientific establishment for centuries afterward. He is remembered today not merely as an artist of the unparalleled skill, but as one of the earliest and most naturally gifted practitioners of what we would now recognize as the scientific method itself: observation, hypothesis, and careful documentation, practiced with an intensity and rigor centuries ahead of his time. Today, Leonardo's name and image appear everywhere in the fabric of modern life, often in ways that extend far beyond the world of art history. Engineering students still study his mechanical drawings for their remarkable prescience. Medical students still marvel at the accuracy of his anatomical sketches. His Vitruvian Man appears on everything from Italian currency to the covers of science textbooks, an enduring visual shorthand for the very idea of human potential and the union of art and reason. The Mona Lisa remains the single most visited work of art in the world, drawing millions of visitors to the Louvre each year, many of whom, standing before that small, quietly enigmatic panel behind its protective glass, may know little of the extraordinary life of the man who painted it, layer by patient layer, over the course of more than a decade, never quite willing to declare it finished. Every time we speak of a person as a Renaissance man capable of excelling across seemingly unrelated fields of art and science, we are, whether we realize it or not, invoking the example of Leonardo da Vinci, the illegitimate son of a Tuscan notary, denied the formal education that might have narrowed his mind into a single respectable profession, who instead, guided by nothing more than his own relentless curiosity and his trust in careful observation, came to understand more about the human body, the natural world, and the mechanics of light and shadow than perhaps any other single mind of his age, and who left behind not a completed body of finished published work, but something arguably more precious. Thousands of pages of questions, sketches, and half-formed answers, an open invitation across 5 centuries to keep looking closely at the world and to keep asking why. The physical survival of his major works remains even now a subject of ongoing concern and effort. The Last Supper, painted with the experimental technique that began deteriorating within his own lifetime, has undergone repeated restoration campaigns across the centuries, most recently a painstaking 20-year conservation project completed in 1999, during which restorers worked millimetre by millimetre to stabilise the fragile remaining paint layers and remove centuries of overpainting and grime, work that allows visitors to the refectory in Milan today to see something far closer to Leonardo's original intention than had been visible for generations. The Mona Lisa, by contrast, protected behind climate-controlled glass in the Louvre, since concerns over environmental damage and, notably, an attempted theft in 1911 that briefly removed the painting from public view for over 2 years before its recovery in Florence, remains in remarkably stable condition, still bearing, according to modern conservators, the same delicate glazes Leonardo applied with such patience over the many years he continued to refine it. Scholarly and public fascination with Leonardo has, if anything, only intensified in recent decades. Advances in imaging technology, including infrared reflectography and X-ray fluorescence scanning, have allowed researchers to peer beneath the visible surface of his paintings, revealing earlier compositional choices, changes of mind, and underdrawings invisible to the naked eye, offering new insight into his working process centuries after his death. In 2017, a painting attributed, with varying degrees of scholarly confidence, to Leonardo and known as Salvator Mundi, depicting Christ holding a crystal orb, sold at auction for approximately $450 million, becoming the most expensive painting ever sold at public auction. A striking testament to the almost unparalleled cultural and market value still attached to his name 5 centuries after his death, even as some scholars continue to debate the precise extent of Leonardo's own hand in the work's execution. Institutions bearing his name, or dedicated to the study of his work, exist today across the world, from the Museo Leonardiano in his birthplace of Vinci, housing models constructed from his engineering drawings, to major research centres devoted to cataloguing and digitising his scattered notebooks, making pages once accessible only to a handful of specialist scholars now viewable in high resolution by anyone with an internet connection anywhere in the world, a form of open access to his private thoughts that Leonardo himself, writing alone by candlelight in a rented room in Milan or a manor house in the Loire Valley, could scarcely have imagined. Perhaps most significantly, the example of Leonardo's working method, the patient, disciplined habit of close observation, joined to boundless curiosity across disciplines, continues to serve as an inspiration far beyond the narrow world of art history. Scientists, engineers, designers, and educators across the modern world continue to invoke his name and his approach as a model for the kind of integrative, cross-disciplinary thinking that our own era, for all its technological advancement, still struggles to cultivate, an approach that resists narrow specialization in favor of the belief, which Leonardo held instinctively and which he never abandoned across his long working life, that all fields of knowledge, art and anatomy, mechanics and painting, water and light are ultimately threads of a single, unified fabric, waiting for a sufficiently patient and curious mind to trace their connections. There is a particular kind of peace in returning, at the end of a long story, to its beginning. We began this evening with a boy born on a spring night in the hills above Vinci, a child with no claim to his father's name, no path toward the university education that might have narrowed and directed his mind, no reason, by the ordinary expectations of his time, to become anything more than a footnote in his family's modest history. And yet here we find ourselves, 5 centuries later, still speaking his name, still standing in quiet lines before a small portrait in Paris, still turning the pages of his notebooks, still learning new things from a man who's been gone for 500 years because he trusted, more than almost anyone before or since, in the simple, patient act of looking closely at the world. Leonardo never finished most of what he began. His great bronze horse was never cast. His flying machines never left the ground. His treatises remained scattered notes rather than published books, and yet somehow across the wide arc of an unfinished life, he left behind more beauty, more insight, and more quiet wonder than nearly any other human being in recorded history. Perhaps that is the gentlest lesson of his long story, that a life need not be finished, need not be tidy, need not close every open question in order to matter enormously. That curiosity itself, patiently followed, hour after hour, page after page, year after year, is its own kind of masterpiece, whether or not the world ever sees the final result. Think of the small boy in the Tuscan hills, turning over stones, watching birds circle above the valley, asking questions no one around him thought to ask. He could not have known, in those quiet childhood afternoons, that he was already becoming the man whose name would still be spoken, with wonder, 500 years later. He was simply looking, simply wondering, and perhaps that, more than any single painting or invention, is the truest legacy he left behind. The quiet reminder that a patient, attentive mind, given enough time and enough gentle curiosity, can find something remarkable in almost anything at all. Somewhere in the quiet chapel at Amboise, beneath a simple stone, the bones once believed to be his rest in soft French earth, not far from the gentle valley of the Loire, within sight of the same chateau where a young king once sat with him in conversation, listening, we can imagine with quiet awe, to a mind that never once stopped moving. And somewhere in Paris, behind glass, a small painted woman continues to hold her quiet, ambiguous smile, exactly as he left her, forever unfinished, forever complete, watched today by more eyes in a single afternoon than saw her in the whole of Leonardo's own lifetime. There is no need to remember every date, every painting, every scattered page of notes. What matters, if anything at all, is the feeling this story leaves behind. A sense of quiet permission to wonder, to look a little longer than usual at the ordinary things around you, a bird outside a window, the way light falls across a room, the slow curve of a hillside. Leonardo asked nothing more of the world than to be allowed to keep looking. Perhaps tonight, that is a gentle enough thought to carry with you into sleep. Thank you for spending this time with the story of Leonardo da Vinci. If it helped carry you toward rest tonight, consider following along for more quiet stories like this one, and feel free to share a thought or a favorite moment in the comments before you drift off. Until next time, sleep well and good night.